that.
I've had lots of failures, things like that, and failure was one of those things that simply was not really allowed in the family, and I roundly heard about that every time it happened, in lots of different ways. Perhaps my most recent failure is I failed to finish seminary, and that worked on me quite a bit, and I've had a very difficult time forgiving myself for that. That inability to forgive myself is the thing that has colored my life now for, well, perhaps 63 of 65 years. And since I've been working through the 12-step programs, I've come to realize that I can do that. I can forgive myself for those errors. It's true I may have made some mistakes, but that doesn't make me want to live my life. They certainly weren't fatal errors.
Well, there's a difference between failing and being a failure. And I'm so glad that he, through a program that he invented, is overcoming that. He says he learns to forgive himself for failing. And I could strain at a gnat here and say, you don't have to forgive yourself for failing. But I'm glad he does it anyway. And I'm glad that it releases him from the burden of having to be a success. My own hunch is that Jim is like so many people, and like myself in some way, that what you feel is a failure to forgive yourself, when what you're suffering is the shame, the feeling of being a bad person that somebody else has laid on you. Jim, in my judgment, is suffering from what I call shame. And that's a hard nut to crack. It's a feeling about yourself. It's a translation of what you did that was either wrong or silly or unsuccessful. And you translate that as the definition of your very being. I lied, I'm a liar. I failed, I'm a failure. I did something crazy, therefore I'm nutty. You follow me? And Jim got snookered by people who were probably good and decent people in other ways, but they did him great harm. And I hope that one day he's going to get so angry with them at that thought that they robbed him of a lot of freedom and a lot of power and a lot of happiness. Shame destroyed your happiness. It disables you. It almost dooms you to failure if it gets a good hold of you. And he didn't deserve any of that.
All right. Let's talk about this, because one of the things that came up the first week when we talked about forgiving, one of the things that you all almost immediately said is that you have to be able to forgive yourself. All right? We talked about that in kind of broad terms, but the importance of forgiving yourself. And you saw in the video here that Smee said that, well, maybe forgiving isn't the best way to think about that. But in your tables, real quickly, I want you all to look at the couple of questions there that I have under Jim. What do we mean when we say we need to forgive ourselves? When he talks about it, letting go of shame. And then, does shame doom us to failure? And if you have time, the last question there, what is the difference between failing and being a failure? Can you talk about those real quick, and then we'll share, and we'll talk about it as a whole.
And that shame and stuff keeps you from reaching out, I think, because you're afraid. It's a fear factor, don't you think?
Yeah, shame is no different than the other side of the spectrum, if you will. If you go into a situation feeling shameful and things, then almost regardless of how that situation turns out, you'll feel like you didn't do your best. like you didn't give as much as you could, because no situation turns out perfectly. So what you take into the situation is often what you get out of it. And so it becomes a downward spiral, if you will. And shame also tells us about ourselves. It convinces us that we are something that we aren't necessarily. And what I mean by that is none of us are perfect, but shame tells us an untruth about ourselves. It tells us that we are a certain way when we're not entirely that way. As he said, I lied, so I'm a liar. Those are two very different things to say, oh, I lied. I need to say I'm sorry, I need to forgive, I need to stop doing that. It's a very different thing than saying, I'm a liar. You know, I lied this time, so I'm a liar. Or I was unkind, so I'm unkind in general. Shame tells us a story about ourselves that's not completely true. And I think we all have some element of that rolling around in our head. I can't do that. You know, you say God's calling you to do this or that. So I'm not fit for that, or I can't do that, or I'm not the person for that job, or this, or we all have that voice in our head that says you're not X, Y, or Z enough. I think that's shame as a broad term here, as we're using it. Now, I heard a lot of you talking about the difference between failing and being a failure. What'd you come up with for that one? What's the difference? Or maybe I just thought I heard
I had failing is a hurdle you can overcome with effort, while being a failure is a label.
Is a label?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But being a failure is also a perception within yourself.
Okay.
Isn't it also like, when you talk about forgiving, you forgive someone for the act that they did, you don't forgive the person for who they are. And
Okay.
failing is an act. You failed doing something, but failure is describing someone who thinks his whole life is a failure. They're two different things.
Certainly.
Well, when I was in college, I would fail an exam, but I graduated, so I was not a failure.
Very good.
I like
Didn't
it.
get a 3.7.
And poor Bill Gates, you know, poor Bill Gates, it's really tough.
You're kind of like me, I golf, but I'm not a golfer.
So some people are willing to keep failing over and over. That's a great personality trait. Failure doesn't bother me at all. Yeah. No, I think you've all hit on it. This idea of failing as an act is something that happens. Being a failure is a way of seeing ourselves. It's something we take on as a description, as a definition of who we are. And I think that that's true. You know, we've all heard various versions of this, but I think being a failure is when you quit trying. There's some truth to that. I think when you just accept failing and say, I'm not going to do anything about that. Now, not if it's something that's inconsequential. I'm not talking about that. But if I say, look, I'm not a affectionate enough husband, but if I just say, and that's just how it is, and that's how it's always going to be, that's a failure. That's a failure. That's not just failing, that's a failure because I've stopped trying.
You've given up
Move
hope.
ahead.
I
Failure
think-
certainly is a lack of hope.
I think it's rooted in shame.
Can be.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Uh,
Linda.
We had a paint party last night in town. I'm sure everybody saw that. But when I was a kid, I was like in the 7th grade. And the teacher, I went to chorus class, and the teacher said to me, "Oh, I think you better go to Mr. Allison's art class." Obviously, I couldn't sing. So I go to Mr. Allison's art class, and he says, "You know, after about a week, I think maybe you need to be in study hall." So do you think last night I painted? No. I watched everybody paint, but I still won't paint. And I don't feel like I'm a failure. I just feel like they made me feel like if you do it, you're not going to be good at it anyway. You know, so that's
Linda, come
You're
join
in
the
charge.
choir.
But, you know, but I'm okay with that, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's kind of shameful in a way to know that you were pushed away twice, but, you know, you just
place
have
to
to
go.
go on.
If that's the only 2 times you've been pushed away, then it's. But no, that's a great example of, in childhood, and I think it happens in adulthood, how probably somewhat well-meaning people put that on us and say, you're not a this, or you can't do that, or you are this, perhaps. When maybe that's true, maybe you can't sing, but it doesn't mean that you're a failure. But we often take it in that way. Let's move on. We're going to watch the next segment here, the next person. And now there's going to be a phrase. It's on your sheet here, but he's going to say, and it's kind of, in my opinion, the most important phrase in this whole study that we're going to talk about in forgiveness. Be paying attention to that. See if you catch it.
What you did, I understand, and it's all right with me.
She's talking about what forgiveness
So
is.
I'm very confused on the issue, even though in many ways it seems central to our faith. I mean, it is in the Our Father. It's a very central part of faith, and I'm having a lot of trouble with it.
Sonia said 2 things to me. One is that forgiving is big in the Christian faith, and it is. And one wonders why. I think it's big in the Christian faith for 2 reasons. One is, I think the Lord knew how often people get hurt, and how often healing is necessary. And he knew that forgiving was the only way to cope with it. There was a marvelous Jewish philosopher by the name of Hannah Arendt, who wrote a magnificent book called The Human Condition. And at the very end of the book, she made this sentence. She wrote this sentence: "The only remedy for the irreversibility of history is the faculty of forgiving." I think our Lord knew that when things happen, they happen, and you can't undo them. And forgiving is the only remedy. Okay, she's dead right about that. Sonia said that to her, forgiving was going to another person and saying, "You hurt me, but I understand, and it's okay." For me, forgiving is going to a person, either in your fantasies or in reality, and saying, "I don't understand. I'll never understand. And it wasn't okay, and it isn't okay. But I forgive." The important thing about Sonia is that I want to respond to is that forgiving does not make a person a doormat. Forgiving isn't the same as tolerance. Forgivers don't have to be fools. Forgiving is healing yourself of something that happened to you that you cannot tolerate, but you forgive it as the only way to heal the wound that it left you with.
I think.
All right, stop there. We're going to discuss this one as a group. Anybody catch the line that I thought was so important?
The one
No, it's not the one from the Jewish philosopher. It says, "I don't understand, I'll never understand. It wasn't okay and it isn't okay. But I forgive you." And I changed the word slightly. I said, "But I choose to forgive you." How many of you coming into this class thought of forgiveness that way? You can raise your hand or not, doesn't matter. How many of you thought of it in that way, that it's saying to someone, I don't get it, I don't understand? Most people who come into my office are struggling to forgive, believe that they need to understand what happened, that they need to accept it, that they need to be at peace with it, that that's the path to forgiveness. Maybe many of you have wrestled with it in that way. But I think he's dead on when he says it's not saying it's okay. It's not saying I understand. It's not saying it'll ever be okay in the future. But I'm going to choose to forgive. Mark?
And when you choose to forgive, are you choosing to not hold any hard feelings associated with all of that? Is that what you're actually doing? Just letting all that emotion go?
Yeah. Did everybody hear her question? She said, when you choose to forgive, are you choosing to let go of the hurt, the anger, letting go of all the emotion that comes along with that? Is that accurate? What do y'all think?
Absolutely.
I think it is, but it's sometimes it's hard to completely forget it. But you gotta move, I feel like you gotta move on. You got to get beyond it, and you know, you may never, again, you're not forgiving them.
Yeah.
But you're just choosing to, well, you are choosing to forgive them, but you're not forgetting them.
Yeah, 2 weeks ago, week 1, that was one of the first things I said, that made a point of, that I don't believe that we're asked to, and I don't think it would be even possible to forgive and forget. I mean, anything that's worthy of forgiving, that needs forgiving. And again, forgiveness isn't, oh, you cut me off last night when we were talking. That's not something you need to forgive. But a deep betrayal, a hurt, if it's worth forgiving, you're not going to forget. So what is it that you are letting go of? I think it's the emotion. It's the hurt, the pain. It's those things. And you know, he says here, forgiving doesn't make you a doormat. What do you think he means about that? Forgiving doesn't make you a doormat.
Because you gave in, basically.
Okay, that forgiving somehow means you gave in. Okay.
Or that they can do it again.
Exactly. But it means it's okay to treat me this way again.
That's where you don't forget.
There you go. That's part of not forgetting, certainly.
That's a trail of abuse.
Okay.
Are you supposed to just keep on forgiving somebody if they do the same thing over and over and over?
All right.
Just keep on forgiving?
Do you hear the question? Are you supposed to keep forgiving somebody over and over and over again? If they keep doing the same thing, what's the answer?
I like what you said, I think it was 2 weeks ago, Father, you said if the relationship isn't positive and you're not getting anything out of it, then it's not worth keeping.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I think if you're going to, if you've got a relationship with someone, you've got two choices. If that relationship's going to continue in a healthy way, then we have to find a way to forgive. Okay. If it's not a healthy relationship, and if the other person doesn't intend for it to be a healthy relationship, then sometimes we have to step away from that relationship. Now, this gets trickier when you're talking about marriages, when kids are involved, and all these things. I recognize that. But ultimately, those are the choices that we have. We can stay in a relationship that's not healthy, and we can not forgive, but we're only perpetuating that unhealth. Now, again, forgiveness doesn't make us a doormat. A woman who's abused comes into my office and talks to me. I will encourage her. I say, yes. She says, should I forgive? I say, yes. You absolutely should forgive, and you should get away from him. If this is going to continue, or if this is a pattern. One of the points that we made from the get-go that I think is maybe always not as obvious, forgiving is not about the other person. We tend to think that it's about the other person. Forgiving is something that we have to do for us. Because if we don't forgive, the anger, the shame, all the things that come along with that eat away at our soul. Now, certainly, forgiving opens the opportunity for that other person to come back into our lives, potentially. But we talked last week about if we're going to have restoration of that relationship, then that person has to be willing to admit they're wrong, and has to be willing to own up to it, and has to make at least an attempt at saying, you know, I'm going to try to avoid this in the future. So forgiving is the only way to truly restore a relationship. there's everything short of that is certainly an option. But if forgiveness is possible, then that's not a good option.
Well, you know, when you forgive yourself, if someone, you know, has done something that really has hurt you, and you have that anger and that hate and whatever it is, I think as you search to forgive yourself and you release all those attachments to that, you know, that you really realize that you are healed, then, you know, sometimes it's not necessarily to even confront the other person, you know, that because, you know, when you realize that you have been healed, you know, you can feel good about walking away from the situation, or somewhere down the line, if you feel gracious enough, you can go and confront that person, but, you know, it's really not about the other person, it's just about you being able to heal yourself, and then go on with your own life. And you don't forget an abuse, but you also, once you are forgiven to yourself, then you really release that, and you don't carry that monkey on your back. And there's a freedom that comes from forgiveness when you forgive yourself. You get a freedom that you otherwise, somehow or another, you know that when you really do forgive yourself, you really know that you are at last free of that hate and whatever else is out there, shame and whatever.
Like what Mary Ann's talking about, all the hate, you might find this helpful. If you say move to Arizona, it will become more of a dry hate.
I'm moving to Arizona.
Like a sense of humor.
Wes?
Yes.
I think forgiveness in some respects, in order to truly be a forgiving person, you have to almost be a little bit selfish to start to think about your own personal needs and what you need for your own personal health. Because carrying all that baggage around with emotion and hate and whatnot is not healthy for you. And once you become a healthy person, you're better for the people around you. But ultimately, first you got to take care of yourself. And I think that's what, you know, sometimes as human beings we have a hard time dealing with that we look to ourselves and take care of ourselves first. We felt like we're supposed to take care of other people. Now, honestly, I do think that part of forgiveness is take care of yourself, and in doing so, you'll become a better person for those around you.
But part of human nature, I've seen several instances of friends that had spats and disagreements, and they were alienated for a number of years. And when they finally reconciled, they couldn't truly put their finger on whatever
Started it all. Yeah. It's amazing how we can stay angry for years and have forgotten really what started it all. We can know the hurt that we've experienced in relationships for years, be able to plug into that and not really remember exactly why or how or why we let it happen or why it happened. We hold on to those pain much more than we hold on to the facts of what happened. Now, when we talk about forgiving, we talk about this, I don't understand, I never understand. One of the questions I ask is, why is this understanding so important to forgiveness? Why is seeing it in this way, why is this important?
Acknowledging, really acknowledging and getting to where you have felt and what caused you to feel the way you are. And it's hard to do. Again, like I say, sometimes over time you don't remember exactly what was said and what happened.
Yeah.
So if you let it go too long, then you're not going to be really able to get to the root of the cause.
Okay.
I think people want to be understood because they think it validates them.
Mm-hmm.
If I understand, or if you understand why you may be mad, then that validates that I had a right to be mad.
Yeah, certainly.
So that's why we want to be understood, and we want
to know everything, because it validates our own thinking.
And I think too, I think that need to understand goes along a little bit with what we talked about in the broad term of vengeance, because we want people to understand how badly they've hurt us, so that at the very least they have to deal with that guilt or shame if we're not going to overtly do something to retaliate. We at least want them to know how badly they've hurt us in a kind of tiny attempt to balance the scales as we talked about. I think one of the reasons why this understanding is so important is because it's not reliant on the other person. That is so important, to recognize that forgiveness is something that we do in ourselves, for ourselves. And it doesn't depend on the other person acting one way or another. Okay? It doesn't, we don't forgive only if we can be sure that they're not going to do it again. We don't forgive only if we're certain they didn't mean it. We don't forgive only if we're certain that we understand where they were coming from and why they did it at the time. It's not about that. Recognizing that forgiveness is not saying it's okay, it's not saying I understand, it doesn't need to be any of those things. It means that the work of forgiveness is in our court all the time. It's ours to do, regardless of the other person. And that's important. If we sit around waiting for people to come and be sorry enough for us to forgive them, then we're going to have a lot of people that we're angry at after 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Most people don't care if you're angry with them.
At that point, they really don't.
No, they don't know. We talk about this. Half the time they don't even know. Like, well, why is Chuck being so pissy all of a sudden? It's his deal, you know?
What's the wrong?
And you're sitting over there saying, don't you know how bad you've hurt me? Half the time people don't know, and then when you do tell them, they're like, seriously? I mean, at least internally, they're like, really? That's what you're upset about? You need to grow up, you know? Most people aren't nearly as upset about it as you are. Don't wait on them.
I remember playing rugby. Someone would give you a cheap shot, and then you get up and they're running off in front of you, and you go up behind them, kick the back of their foot, and trip them.
Oh, vengeance.
Called vengeance.
Well, Jesus was the saint on the cross when he said, Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That wasn't them understanding what they did wrong.
Certainly.
So it's a tremendous example of being a Christian.
Yeah, definitely. So again, I'm going to ask one of the questions I asked them first, but we're not going to get into the next section here tonight. But one of the first questions I asked is, and this is kind of a two-part, but what is our example of forgiveness, and why is it so? Why is it important for us to forgive? Or why should we be compelled to forgive?
Jesus forgives us.
What?
Because Jesus has forgiven us for all the things that we've done.
Okay. Yeah. Certainly. God's example to us is forgiveness that's not dependent on our understanding, our remorse, etc., etc. We ask, and it's granted. If we know that we've been forgiven, that should compel us to want to forgive. If we truly accept that forgiveness, if we know the freedom of that, we should want that for others.
It's like Mary Ann said, if you don't forgive, then you're stuck. You've got all those attachments, you've got all those emotions, and you're stewing and you're stewing. But if you do forgive internally and clear all that stuff out, then you're where you're supposed to be with God.
And the important piece here is, remember, we're talking about restoration of relationship with God. You might be sitting there saying, well, wait, God asks for us to ask to repent, to ask for forgiveness. I thought that's not how it worked. But that's, remember I said, if we're going to restore the relationship, the other person has to recognize where they've fallen short. They don't necessarily have to make amends, but they have to recognize it and say, I'm going to do my best to not do that again. And at that point, God says, I've already forgiven you. That already happened, but now we can be in right relationship. You see what I'm saying? You see how the model still fits?
Situation you've got, if you can, and if there's an opportunity, going to the other person and at least letting them know where you stand, then they got a chance to react, positive, negative, or whatever. But if you never say, I mean, like I say, then you go a year or two later and they go, what?
Yeah.
What was that? That's what you're mad at me about?
Yeah. Certainly.
That's hard to
Joe?
What you're saying about why it's important is if you don't have that relationship with your Heavenly Father that you ought to have. What is it? Is it, my memory serves me right about if you have aught against your brother, you're supposed to, was it lay down your offering and go before you come and finish that worship?
Yeah. Yeah, if you come to the altar and you got an issue with your brother, sister, your neighbor, etc., go and make that right and then come back and make your offering to God. In other words, those relationships need to be right for our relationship to be right.
We should be leaving the altar all the time then.
I told you 2 weeks ago, that's what the peace is for. That's what it's supposed to be, is that chance to go and make peace with your brothers and sisters. I've said to you that, in theory, it's supposed to be, if you're going to someone, it's because you got an issue with them. That's historically how it's supposed to be. Now, you all greet everyone, so.
Either we don't understand or we got a lot of issues.
There you go. There you go. But no, that comes straight from Matthew 26, and that's what the peace is intended to be. If you got issues with the people around you, make it right before you come up here.
There's some churches that they pass the peace by holding hands across the church, and it was in one church where we were, they cut it out because there were too many families and issues, and they could not hold the hand of the person next to them. It was sad.
No, that happens. All right, let's close with prayer. Let us pray. Dear Lord, we give you thanks for the loving kindness which you show to us over and over again. Help us to understand the power and the importance of forgiveness in our lives. Help us to embrace it not simply as a duty, but rather as a tool to prepare our hearts to be the people that you've called us to be. Help us to lay down anger, hurt, suspicion, and doubt so that we can love fully, freely, and completely. All this we ask in your Son's holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Anyone find another glove?
Missing a black leather glove. Anybody find one?
If it doesn't fit, you must